They tell me now that bones don't have memories, that fossils don't remember the breaths and storms and sweetness of figs dripped down a child's chin. But I swear the first time I saw those teeth in the red dirt, white as chalk and heavy as a secret, something old looked back at me. Maybe it was only my own face, because the sun was right above us and the earth was a mirror of each speck of light, but I felt seen by the past. I was 12 that summer, and it was the summer the wind changed in our village. In the mornings the wind smelled like thyme and dust and sheep, and at night the radio spoke in a quivering voice about Athens and Cyprus and soldiers, and I would lie on the cool stones of our courtyard and look up at the wrinkled sky and wonder how old everything could be. We lived in a village that seemed tucked into the fold of a hill, like a handkerchief in a grandfather's sleeve. Our house had whitewashed walls with soft places where the rain had gnawed a little hole, and my mother had smeared more white over it with the same hand she kneaded dough. Her palms smelled always of flour and lemon and something warm. When she hugged me, my hair trapped that soot-like smell of wood smoke from the oven outside. Papo, my grandfather, had a chair that was his, in the shade of the fig tree by the low wall, and his cambeloy the amber worry beads left dents in his fingers. He would flick the beads and hum a bit of a song that made no sense, just syllables of old fishermen and old soldiers and old loves, and he'd watch the hills behind our house like a shepherd counts his sheep. It was late June when the first truck came sputtering into the village. Even before I saw it I knew it wasn't one of ours. Town trucks breathed in a different way, like a man who doesn't know the hills yet. The road to us was a narrow ribbon that peeled off the main road from Thessaloniki and hesitated and then made up its mind to climb. The truck was light blue under a coat of dust, and the back held wooden crates lashed with rope, a rolled tent, and a dozen tools that I later learned the names of: picks and trowels, brushes and sieves, a bulky camera, a stack of notebooks with rubber bands around them. A second car followed, a small one, with dull paint and a little flag pinned to the aerial, a tricolory that fluttered like a bird's wing. My cousin Maria and I ran to the corner by the Cafeño, barefoot, my sandals thwacking against my heels because one had broken and Mama hadn't had time to fix it with wire. The grown UPS were already coming out, the men shading their eyes with their hands, some with cigarettes between their fingers, the women half hidden behind door frames because it was not their business, not yet, but you could see a flash of curiosity in their eyes. Mr. Stavros, who ran the Cafeño and always had an opinion, put down his broom across the doorway like a barrier only his chest could pass. "Foreigners," he said, and then softer, "and one of ours with them." He meant the girl who climbed out of the small car. She was in her 20s and tall, with her hair in a scarf and her sleeves rolled up, her arms already the color of toasted bread. She looked like she had walked through a storm and loved it. She said Calimera, good morning, and smiled, and I swear every cat in the village paused mid-slink and listened. The man who climbed carefully after her was small, with gray hair and a soft mound of a belly and glasses that had slipped down his nose. He wore a hat and a short-sleeved shirt with a pencil tucked behind his ear. He said bonjour and the hats in the Cafeño tilted, the way they do when someone says something innocent in a language that feels like a river stone in your palm. He looked at the hills the way Papo looked at sheep, his eyes counting something that wasn't visible, and he took a breath that sounded like a boy before he jumps in the sea. "Where is the priest?" someone asked under his breath, which is the same as asking, "Where is permission?" "Where is everybody?" the girl asked, in Greek. "We are late, we are sorry to come like a wind into your home." "We called the university, they said the president of the village." "That's me," said Mr. Stavros, puffing up like a rooster. He put out his hand. She took it as if it were a lifeline. "I'm Eleni," she said. "From the university. We came to look for old bones." Bones of animals. Ancient. Who's he? A man asked, jerking his chin at the Frenchman. Our professor, Eleni said. He'll tell you, but he asks me to try, my Greek is better. She smiled at us all again like we were her cousins. We believe, she said, that in the gully above the North Ridge, the one where the rain eats the earth, the ravine, said Papo, who had come slowly up the road with his cane tapping like a shy drummer. The rain gully. Nah. Yes, Eleni said. That there, in the red layers, are fossils from long ago. There have been bones in nearby places, and the land tells stories if you listen. We are very careful. We will not harm your fields. We will hire men. We ask permission. She was good. She saw what mattered, permission and money and the reassurance that the earth would be left in peace. The men looked at each other like roosters on a roof deciding whether to crow. We don't need money, someone said, but he said it in the way that means, yes, we do, but we want your respect first. The professor took off his hat and bowed a little. Please, he said, in careful Greek, we will pay for your help. We will take only bones, and only where the land is already broken. We will make it clean when we leave. He put his hat back on his head as if replacing a roof. Exactly. Bones of what? Asked Mama finally, stepping into the sunlight like she had been planning it all along. Her hands were on her hips, and her hair had escaped from under the scarf and stuck to her forehead. You say animals. But which ones? Everything, Eleni said, her eyes bright. Horses with 3 toes. Rhinoceroses without horns that look like you know them, but they're not ours. Mastodons, which are like elephants, only their teeth are like little stairs. And, maybe, apes. She said it with a smile that could have been mischievous or a little bit sacred. The village murmured like pigeons. Monkeys, someone said, and laughed, because we all had seen the circus monkeys in the town across the plain once, and they had worn little vests and begged with cups and stolen olives from children. Why dig for those? Not circus monkeys, Eleni said, and she rolled her wrist slowly, searching for a word that doesn't exist in every corner of every village. Old ones. Cousins of what became, us. Not our grandfathers, no. But family. Maybe. Papa wasn't there, he was out with the goats, and later he said it was just as well, because he didn't like being asked about permission for land that he didn't own but carried in his feet. But Papo cleared his throat like a small thunder. He had the authority that comes from being old and a little bit funny. The earth is older than any of our claims, he said. We are just the ones who carry the water for now. Let them look. And if they find something, let them tell us what the old earth says. That was how, without paperwork or speeches, the summer's chapter started. I was at the gully from sunrise to sunset those next days. I pretended it was because Mama needed me out from underfoot and because I could carry water and because I could make myself useful with the boys who brought baskets of dirt to the sieve, but really I went because I liked guitars that tune themselves under the fingers of someone who knows. The professor touched the ground that way. There is a sound to a pick in red clay that is different from the sound it makes in the thin brown topsoil where weeds cling. A trowel against rock sings and stops depending on what the rock is. The professor and Eleni and the students from the city, their names a bouquet, Nikos, with his eyebrows like hedges, a sif, from far away, whose Greek was all nouns and love, Vaso, who wore big sunglasses like a movie star and could sit cross-legged for hours and never get tired. They moved in the gully like the wind had told them secrets, and they scooped and brushed and then stopped and looked at each other. I learned that a fossil isn't just a thing you pry out like a snail from its shell. It's a handshake with patience. The ravine was a shallow wound in the hillside, red on the bottom where the clay held onto water in the winter and then cracked like old paint in the summer. The layers tipped up at a slant, younger on top, older as you leaned into the cut of the earth. The topmost bits were brittle and full of roots, and Mama's broom would have made them into dust in a minute if you let her near it. Below that, there were salmon-colored bands that sometimes gave small anti-gift snail shells, flinty chips, the tooth of a little deer. And then the red, the blood of time, thick and heavy, and in it sometimes a white grin of enamel. You'd never see it if you were in a hurry. If you stood up, you'd miss it. It was found on your knees. We built a shade with sticks and an old sheet, and I learned to make tea on a camp stove and not spill it on anyone you loved. We set up screens where the boys poured buckets of dirt and we shook them and out fell small treasures, the smooth bead of a bead, no, I mean it, a bead someone wore once, much later than the apes, which Eleni held like a baby and then buried again gently, the claw of a bird, the little triangle of a fish vertebra, which Vaso kissed and then laughed at herself, because how did a fish end up in a hill 40 kilometers from the sea, and then she said, the sea used to come and go where it pleased. And that made all of us look at the sky like it was standing on our heads. The professor worked mostly in a corner of the gully that he had marked on a map with very straight pencils. He hummed to himself sometimes, something that could have been a lullaby or a protest song, I couldn't tell. In the afternoons, when the heat was like a blanket you didn't ask for and couldn't kick off, the cicadas sang in a way that made your bones itch. We ate bread and tomatoes with salt, and sometimes Mrs. Stavroula, who had lost a son in a way that was never explained and who healed everything with food, brought us spanakopita and apricots and a bottle of retsina. The grown ups drank that in tiny sips, their lips pursed like playing the flute, and we children ate apricots until our tongues were furry with sweetness. The juice got sticky on my fingers, and the red earth powder kissed it, and I would look at my hands and see a map, a line of dust here like a river, a crescent of tooth enamel lodged under a fingernail like a moon. When I went home at night I was always tired and always awake, a combination that I didn't know you could be. Mama stood at the kitchen table and rolled phyllo, thin, and the rolling pin sounded like drums muffled by clouds, and the radio was that week's voice of the grown ups. Some nights it whispered like someone telling secrets in a church. Some nights it crackled like electricity. It said words I didn't know yet, like coup and mobilization and negotiation, and it said names like they were thorns you had to pluck carefully, and I fell asleep with a piece of bread in my hands sometimes and dreamed of bones that moved like fish. On Sundays, we dressed in our good clothes even though it was too hot for good clothes and went to church, and the priest looked at my red knees and smiled because his were red, too, and he said to me after the liturgy, "Are you helping our guests, Yanni?" "Yes, Father," I said. "I carry water." And they let me brush things. "Brush what?" "Time," I said, and then felt shy because it sounded like something a poet would say, and I was just a boy. But he nodded and patted my shoulder with his big hand and said, "That's a good chore for the summer." I brought Eleni figs from our tree and she taught me words. "Strata," she said, and layers. "Sediment," she said, and then "Don't worry about that one, you say dirt and I know what you mean." She explained that teeth were better than bones because teeth were made to last. They had enamel, the hardest part, like a shield. And jaws are a gift, she said, because they tell you who a person eats and what they eat and how they hold their head. She showed me how to look for the contrast between the red of the clay and the very white of a tooth, and also to be careful because sometimes the white was a pebble and the teeth were actually brown. Nothing is simple, she said with a smile. Which is why it is good. She drew a quick picture in the dust with a stick, a layer on top, a layer below, a spear of hard rock cutting through. This is the past, she said, in slices, as if someone cut a cake and then tilted the plate. She laughed, pointing at the cake that wasn't there. What are you hoping to find? I asked, though she had told us. She took a breath and looked out over the dry fields and the line of poplars that tried to be soldiers. A jaw, she said. I dream of a jaw. Big teeth, thick enamel. Something that tells a story about diet, and about our cousins. From a time when your hills were forests, and animals moved like ships through green shade. But I will be happy with a horse tooth. Or a turtle shell. Or anything the land shares. I made a jaw with my hand, my thumb an invisible chin. Like this? I asked. Bigger, she said, laughing. Much bigger. Like Papo's when he takes out his teeth. I asked, and she laughed harder, a sound like bells in a wind so hot it forgets what wind is. You, she said, are dangerous. The professor was gentle with his new assistants, the men from the village who had come because there was always work to do and this work was less back-breaking than some and because the professor's eyes were kind. He showed them not to put the pick too deep, how to use the trowel as if shaving a man's face, how to hold a brush. He mixed plaster in a bucket and showed me how it went from water that ran over your hands like a summer rain to a paste that clung like clay on your knee to a hard shell in a few minutes, cradling something inside. He taught me to taste a little bit of earth on the tip of my tongue, just a bit, to know if it was salty or not, if it had been washed by ancient waters or put down by the slow death of plants. It is like tasting history, he said. And I didn't tell Mama that part because she would have swatted me with the dishcloth for eating dirt. At night in the square the men drank their coffee and kept their voices low when talking about the radio. The women talked about the same things but with more life in their hands. They peeled cucumbers and snapped beans into bowls and their fingers told the story while their mouths kept rhythm. The priest came sometimes and the old men played backgammon and their checkers clacked like the stones in the gully. Papo would take his cambeloy and wrap it around my wrist like a prayer bracelet and say, "Don't be too serious, Yanni. Life is a river." Then he would laugh at himself and drink his coffee and ask me about the gully the way other grandfathers asked about school. He had never been to school long, he said. The war and then work had eaten the time. But he knew things about the land that no book had taught. He knew where the winter water went under the hill, where it rose in a patch of green so small you'd miss it unless you were thirsty. He knew which wind would bring the storm even when the sky looked like a stubborn donkey that wouldn't move. The day I found the jaw began as an ordinary day, which is how you always tell the story, right? But it did. It began with a lazy morning and a sound of pigeons under the eaves and a quarrel between cats that sounded like someone had decided to teach the violin in the alley. Mama sent me with a piece of bread and cheese and said, "Don't eat everything in the first 5 minutes." Again. I swore I wouldn't and then I did, over the walk to the gully. The air was already too hot and the light already too bright, like the sun had gotten out of bed early to get a head start on us. Down in the ravine it was cooler, and our shade was still doing its job. Someone had stretched another sheet. Eleni gave me a brush and assigned me to a corner where the clay was red as a tomato. "Here," she said, "go slow. This layer," and she touched the earth so gently, "has given us 2 horse teeth and a fragment of rhinoceros horn. It owes us something." She winked. The professor was in the other corner, crouched like a frog, speaking to himself in that language that sounds like a baker kneading vowels, French. He would say bone and dousement and sometimes huh, like he had been tapped on the shoulder by a ghost. I liked to watch his hands because they were quick and then slow, quick and then slow, as if a muscle that played a special instrument inside him tuned and rested, tuned and rested. I sat on my heels and brushed. The trick, I had learned, is not to try to make the earth into what you want. The trick is to remove everything that is in the way until the thing reveals itself. You don't so much find as arrive. So I brushed and blew gently and brushed again. A fly interested in my sweaty ear came and went and I ignored him because to swat at him would have meant losing track of my breath's own rhythm. And then I saw it, a bit of white, no bigger than an almond, but shining in a different way than a pebble. Stone glows. Enamel holds light. I froze, my brush mid-air. My heart tapped in my throat like a badly tuned drum. I looked at Eleni and opened my mouth, and she saw and put her hand up the way a teacher in church puts up her hand to make children be still. She came over on her knees with the quiet of someone barefoot on a stone floor. She bent her head so close to mine I could see the sweat make a little road down her temple. "What do we have?" she whispered, and I felt a pride in my chest that made me taller. "I don't know yet," I whispered back. "A tooth? Maybe." She nodded. "Show me." So I didn't point, because pointing would have meant a big, stupid gesture that could dislodge half the hill and knock an old world down. I lifted the brush and stroked the red around the white sliver, slow, like bathing a baby. A little more showed, and it had a curve like the corner of a moon. I brushed away from it, not toward it, because dragging grit across enamel scratches it. Eleni's hand was on the earth next to me, and I could feel her steadiness, and then she leaned in and touched the soil with her finger next to the white bit and pressed very gently. The red clay gave a little, like a cake you press to see if it's done. The white didn't. Her eyebrows went up so far they disappeared under her scarf. "Professor," she said softly, but the professor was already there, because the air brings news even if people haven't spoken it yet. He knelt and pushed his glasses up with one finger and then reached out a hand not to touch but to pause the world. He looked at the little crescent of enamel and then at us and then at the sky for 1 second, as if to say thank you to someone who had told him a story, and then he nodded to me. "Continue," he said in Greek, and you could tell that behind those letters swam the French for the same word. He had decided that the boy would be the one to keep brushing. "You don't forget that kind of permission." So I continued. I brushed and breathed. I brushed and thought of nothing except red and white and the way my hand felt like my hand belonged to someone else who was very patient. More white showed, then the edge of another piece, and then a line of black-brown that was like the seam of a door. "Jaw," Eleni said, not like a huge announcement but like naming a friend who has just walked into a room. "Left side." "Molar." "Another molar." "Maybe the third." She was speaking to herself and to the professor and to the earth, all at once. "Look how thick." My God. The professor's hands were on his knees, and he was still as a photograph. He let out a breath. "Yanni," he said to me, "you will make me old." Dousement. I went slower. The earth around the bone was not exactly clay now, it was a mix of sandier stuff that had snuck in, and it crumbled if you breathed wrong. I flicked it away grain by grain. Eleni took her own brush and mirrored me on the other side of the little white that had become a big white, and we met in the middle, like builders constructing a bridge from two sides and praying that they find each other. The jaw emerged, a piece of deep brown bone, wide and heavy looking even though it was only the color that told us so. The teeth had thick enamel, so thick the edges looked blunt. A line of something that was like a tiny canyon ran between two molars, the crests high. This one ate hard things, Eleni murmured, excited and reverent. Seeds. Nuts. Fruits dried in the mouth of summer. An ape? I asked, and the word felt like when you ask a girl if she likes you and it's possible you have misunderstood everything. The professor leaned in and peered so close I thought his glasses would touch the earth, and he smiled in a way that was small and which shook around his eyes. We, he said, and then in Greek, yes. Ape. One of ours. One of yours. Not monkey, Eleni added, and laughed a little, sparks popping in her laugh. Not the circus. An ape. An old one from when this was not a red gully but a place with trees and water and shade. Maybe from the group we call, here she searched me for a word and found one that felt like a leaf floating on water, Ouranopithecus. I repeated it under my breath, Ouranopithecus. It felt like a little bird taking off. What does it mean? I asked. She grinned. It is a Greek name, of course, she said, proud. From Ouranos sky and Pithekos ape. Someone named a fossil that way because, well, the explanation is for another day. But the name is ours. And there were already fossils like these found in our Macedonia, in layers like this, with big teeth like these. This might be another. Or a cousin. The professor will measure and compare and write, and in the end the other professors will argue, because that is their job, and then they will agree, because they like to go to conferences and drink coffee together, and they will put this jaw in a museum with a small label. A small label for a big thing, I said. That is always how it is, she said with a twist of her mouth. We didn't lift it that day. We built a little wall of sticks around the spot and tied ropes to keep our feet away. We dripped water near it to keep the clay from drying into brick. We covered it at night with a piece of paper and a tile so the wind wouldn't knock it off, and then with a small board, and you could almost miss it if you didn't know what you were looking for. That felt like a secret and a responsibility. I had dreams that night that the jaw spoke to me, not in words but in the sound it made when it was still inside the head of something big, like a small thunder from chewing. It wasn't scary. It was like hearing a neighbor cough through the thin wall in winter and knowing they were alive. The next day we prepared the plaster. The professor showed me again, though I had already watched him do it and my hands remembered. Water, powder, stir but not like you're angry. We brushed a liquid called consolidant into the exposed parts to make them strong. We made a trench around the fossil, like a moat, leaving it on a pedestal. It was like building a little castle around a sleeping king. Mama came to watch and stood with her hands folded in front of her as if she had walked into church by mistake. The priest came, too, and 3 little boys whose noses always ran and who were good at finding snakes. Even Papo walked slowly up and perched on a rock and squinted at us like a falcon that had misplaced his spectacles. The plaster felt cool on my hands, and then it warmed, in that way that makes you think you're doing magic instead of chemistry. We laid strips of plaster-soaked cloth over the fossil and the little pedestal, overlapping them like leaves. I felt like we were mummifying a pharaoh, which is a story I had in my picture book, but this was older than any pharaoh. We put a second layer of plaster, then a third, and waited until it was hard as shell, white and smooth. Then we undercut the pedestal, little by little, with the trowel and a wide flat blade that made a sound like a muted cymbal. The plaster jacket wobbled once and my heart jumped into my throat, but the professor steadied it with a hand and Eleni held it and all of us breathed out at the same time. We turned it gently, like you turn a sleeping baby and worry it will wake, and put it on the board. I wanted to cradle it in my lap, but I could see by the professor's eyes that this was not that kind of love. He wrote on the jacket letters and numbers that meant the place and the date, and then he wrote the word I loved, Aurano, with a question mark. "We are careful," he said to me like an apology and a promise at the same time. "We will not say more than we have reason to." That evening the village made a feast. Not because of the jaw, exactly, but because any excuse will do in a place where someone always has a watermelon, and someone always has a chicken, and someone always knows a song. The square smelled like grilled meat and crushed oregano, like lemon squeezed over something that was not expecting a kiss. The men set the plaster jacket on a table near the cafeteria, and the old women came and crossed themselves and then laughed at themselves and then crossed themselves again because you never know. Children came and poked it and were chased off with a rag. The cat sniffed it and decided it wasn't a fish, which was disappointing. The radio was on, louder than usual, and it said things that made the men drink their coffee in fast sips and then slow. There had been trouble in Cyprus, then an invasion, then more trouble. The voices in Athens were changing. Names changed. The priest smiled, then smoothed his face, and then smiled again. "Careful," someone said under their breath, "but you cannot put a lid on a boiling pot forever." Someone had brought a bouzouki, and someone else a goatskin drum, and a girl with a flower in her hair sang a song that had been forbidden a few months ago and now came out of her like a bird that had been caged and then remembered how to fly. My mother danced with her scarf in her hand, and the scarf drew lines in the air that were maps to some place we all knew and had forgotten. What did Papo do while all this happened? He took me by the shoulder and pointed at the plaster shell on the table and said, "You touched something older than mountains." I said, "No, Papo, the mountains are older," and he laughed and pulled my ear gently and said, "Don't be too clever. It's bad for your hair." Then he said, "You will go to the city and see that thing behind glass when the time comes. You will tell the man in a nice suit, 'I brushed this.' And he will not believe you. But that does not matter." The days after that were a blur of more digging, more small finds, more red on my knees, more tea that tasted like metal cups. The professor took the jaw to the university and then to a small museum. He and Eleni came back with news like sparrows. Yes, it looked like the one from the other side in Macedonia, the one other people had found years ago, with thick enamel and a heavy jaw. They showed us a drawing in a book of a reconstructed face, an ape with shaggy hair and eyes that looked past the page and into the hill behind it. "He is not your grandfather," Eleni said to me gently, "but he is your cousin. And in the way of all cousins, he tells you something about your family you had forgotten to ask." I didn't fully understand, but I liked the idea that in the blood of our land there had been a thing that used its hands like mine, that chewed a fig like me, that walked under a green roof and thought maybe something like the thoughts that run through a mind when it is quiet and the sun is a warmth not a hammer. I started to see time differently. Before, the past was what my father said when he talked about his military service, or what my grandmother said when she told me stories of the village before the road came. It was a kitchen smell, not a hill. Now the past was a stack of rooms with the floors knocked at an angle so you could step from one into another if you had the right shoes. I'd walk the goat path to the spring and there would be a stone, and I'd wonder if someone else had stepped on it before when it was in a riverbed and the river was somewhere else. If I put my hand in the cold water of the spring, my fingertips tingled as if they had touched the hand of someone far back and far forward. Even the church felt older, its white walls and blue-domed shadow older in a way that made new sense. The priest said to me once, "Sometimes the earth and heaven meet in places we expect, sometimes in places we don't. Be gentle with both." There were days the radio made the grown UPS go still. There are details I will not put here because they belong to other men's faces and because the world turned around that summer in a way that shook some people off and others on. I remember one night when the men stayed late in the square, whispering, and someone cried and someone else sang with his face turned away. The next morning the church bells rang not only for liturgy but for a different kind of dawn. Men hugged each other the awkward way men do who have been taught not to cry. There was talk of democracy returning like a prodigal son. There was talk of our boys called up and then waved back. I remember the way the light looked on the poplars, like someone had painted them with a thin gold brush. Eleni took my hand that day when she and the professor walked to the gully for just a look, just to make sure the ropes were still tied. We stood at the edge and looked at the place where the jaw had been, now just a scar on the earth, plaster dust in the creases. The cicadas hadn't gotten the news that anything had changed, or maybe they were the ones who carried it. The professor did his bow again to the hill, his hat over his heart this time. Merci, he said. Ifshristo. He said it the way you say the name of someone you love. When the season was over and the sun had browned me to a color Mama later said made me look like a roasted chestnut, Eleni asked my mother if I could come to the city to see the lab. She said there was a bus on Friday that went early and came back late, and that the museum would let us in if we smiled and if